Part 2. This is a continuation of the story. The link to the first part is in the description of this video. Enjoy watching. The only place in Manhattan I was familiar with was Central Park, so I decided to head there to escape the chaotic city. At one of the park's entrances, a young woman in her mid-20s was playing guitar and singing. She wore a shabby sundress and had stringy blonde hair. Despite her thin appearance, she had a pretty face. In front of her was an open guitar case for donations. From the amount of money in it, it was clear she relied on this to eat, which explained her thinness. I was intrigued by her. Although she could barely play the guitar, her voice was beautiful. I examined her bare arms for signs of addiction but found none. The more I watched her, the more intrigued I became. I reached into my wallet, pulled out $100, and moved closer to her. "How are you doing?" I asked politely. Her eyes filled with fear and uncertainty. "Okay," she mumbled. "Tell you what," I said with a smile, "I'll give you $100 if you let me play the guitar while you sing." "I don't do any weird stuff," she said angrily. "Look, I know this is New York City where everyone is a bit strange, but this is a straightforward offer, $100 if you let me play the guitar while you sing. Of course, I'll probably sing a bit myself." The young woman scrutinized me, then the $100 bill. I could almost see her thoughts racing. She clearly wanted the money but was wary of my intentions. Just to show I'm on the up and up, I continued, aiming to reassure her, "I'll put $200 in your case right now. If you want the deal, ask someone to hand me the guitar. I bet that guitar didn't cost you more than $50. If you don't want the deal, I'll take the $200 back and leave." I tossed the $200 into the case and stepped back. After a few moments of contemplation, the young woman asked a teenager to hand me her guitar. I took it and started tuning it. It was old and quite worn, so it took a bit of effort to get a decent sound out of it. I looked over at her and asked, "What's your name?" "Dawn," she replied softly. "Well, Dawn, my name is Robbie. What songs do you know?" She rattled off about a dozen, all of which I knew. After a moment's thought, I decided we'd start with Amazing Grace, a song that resonates with most people. I wasn't sure how New Yorkers would react, but even if it only touched half of them, that would be something. We started off a bit rough, as it was my first time performing with Dawn and, of course, she wasn't a professional. But we quickly found our rhythm. With Dawn's crystal clear voice and my guitar playing, we began to draw a crowd. Donations started coming in, and soon there were around 30 or 40 people gathered around us. After about an hour and a half, I saw Dawn checking her watch. "I've got to go," she announced suddenly, jumping to her feet. "What's the rush?" I asked. "People are just starting to come out for lunch. I've got to get back to New Jersey to pick up my daughter," she said, which was a solid reason to end our impromptu concert. I was disappointed, as I was genuinely enjoying myself. Reluctantly, I handed the guitar back. Dawn tried to stuff it into the case, but it wouldn't close because of all the money. I estimated that with the $200 I'd added, she had nearly $400, though much of it was in coins. She scooped out the coins and put them into her pockets and purse, causing her to jingle as she walked. "How are you getting home?" I asked, following her out to the sidewalk. "I'll take the bus from the Port Authority and transfer when I get to the New Jersey side." "I can't let you do that," I said. "It won't be safe. You sound like a walking piggy bank." "I can't afford to go any other way," she replied, picking up her pace as if trying to leave me behind. "Wait a minute," I said, whistling for a cab. "I'll pay your cab fare." "I told you, I don't do weird," she said, her anger clear. "I'm not going anywhere with you," she said, as I opened the cab door and stepped back. "Just tell the driver where you want to go." The cabbie grumbled about going to New Jersey, which was typical of New Yorkers. "What's it going to cost?" I asked, trying to sound more authoritative than he did. He thought for a moment and said, $70. "How about $100? I said, holding up 5 $20 bills. Then I turned to Dawn. "I'm only in town for tomorrow. I'll be flying out the day after. If you want to play again, I'll meet you here at 10 in the morning. If you can't make it, that's okay too." but if you do show up, I think you'll do even better than today." As I watched the cab drive away, an idea began to form in my mind about how to get back at Tanya. I planned to revisit it the next day if Dawn showed up. The day before, Tanya had blindsided me with divorce papers, freezing all our personal and company assets and putting a restraining order against me. She accused me of mental and physical abuse, which felt like hitting rock bottom. But what really devastated me was discovering that Tanya had stolen all my songs, some of which had great sentimental value. I knew she would destroy my originals once she copied them into her own handwriting. Yesterday, I had been filled with self-pity, but today I was consumed with a burning desire for revenge against my cheating wife and her business manager and lover. I had an idea about how to get back at them, and if nothing else, it would restore my self-respect. Their attempt to strand me in New York City had really enraged me. I realized that they wanted to humiliate me and buy time to return to Atlanta and implement their plan. I was sure they wanted to record the stolen songs and spread lies about me. They canceled my first-class ticket and replaced it with an economy one for a flight 3 days later, hoping that I'd become enraged and make a mistake they could use against me. If Tanya and Todd had let me return with them on the same day, I wouldn't have had the chance to meet Dawn in Central Park. It was clear that Tanya and Todd wanted to trap me in New York, believing that if I had no financial resources, I'd become desperate. However, they didn't know I had significant funds in my own name. As I sat in my hotel room planning my revenge, I realized I was severely limited in what I could do. I couldn't touch them physically, emotionally, or financially at the moment. Though the thought of killing both of them had crossed my mind several times, I discarded it each time. I was not a man of violence, and more importantly, it would be too quick and easy. I wanted Tanya to suffer for a long time. It was evident that Tanya had fallen into the trap my granddaddy had warned me about. She was consumed by the desire to become a megastar and was blind to everything else. My old agent confirmed this when he informed me that Tanya was rebranding her musical image, leaving me completely out of the picture. Tanya sought to gain publicity and sympathy by portraying me as the evil partner who abused her, but I wasn't going to play their game. I had a vague idea of how to strike back, hinging on whether Dawn would show up today and if she was willing to trust me. It was likely the only way I could retaliate against Tanya. I planned to sabotage her new act and attempt to become a bigger star than she could ever be. Dawn seemed to be the key to my plan, but if she didn't show up, I wouldn't know what to do since I had no way to contact her and didn't even know her last name. Despite my deep concern about whether she would arrive, by 10 o'clock I felt a renewed energy. All the time I had spent playing and singing with Dawn made me forget about Tanya, but the pain and self-pity came rushing back that night, bringing tears. However, with the morning came a renewed focus, and I grabbed a quick shower, had breakfast, and went out to buy a guitar from a music store that opened at 9 o'clock. It wasn't expensive, but it cost at least 4 times what Dawn's cost and was a significant upgrade. By 9:30, I was sitting on the stairs, convinced that Dawn wasn't coming. At 10:20, I began packing up my new guitar, bitterly disappointed. Just as I was about to leave, I saw her hurrying down the street, clutching a little girl's hand. Dawn was trying to move as fast as possible, but the child's short legs limited their speed. "I was afraid you weren't coming," I said to an out-of-breath Dawn. "I'm sorry," she apologized, explaining she couldn't find anyone to watch her daughter. As she caught her breath, her eyes showed uncertainty, as if she was afraid I'd be mad. She looked up at me with trembling lips. "Don't worry," I grinned, holding up my new guitar. It gave me a chance to buy a new one. "Wow, that's a really nice one," Dawn said, looking between my guitar and hers. "It's not that good," I replied as I began tuning it. "Still, it's an upgrade from that old thing you use." As I tuned the guitar, I looked over at Dawn and her daughter, who was about 4 or 5 years old. The resemblance was clear. Dawn had brushed her hair and put on a bit of makeup, wearing a different dress that was as threadbare as the old one. She was pretty but too thin, and sadly, her daughter looked too thin as well. If they were surviving on Dawn's singing income in New York City, they were in bad shape. The little girl clung to her mother's leg, occasionally peeking out at me. I smiled at her and said, "You're a pretty little girl. Are you going to help us sing?" The girl quickly hid her face against her mother's side. Dawn apologized, saying, "She's very shy." "No need to apologize," I offered easily. When I was a kid, I wouldn't come out of my room if someone came to visit. Suddenly, I remembered I had brought some snacks from the hotel room. I still had plenty after restocking the minibar. Would you like some cookies? I offered, holding out a package of chocolate chip cookies. The little girl looked at the package, then at her mother. Dawn nodded, but Allison wouldn't take them from me, so I handed them to her mother. She's smart not to take cookies from someone as strange as me. Dawn smiled and then knelt next to her daughter. This nice man and I are going to sing some songs. I want you to be a good girl and sit next to me. You can eat the cookies while we play. Can you do that? Allison nodded but said nothing. Soon, she was sitting next to her mother, munching on the small package of cookies. It was clear that the girl was hungry. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a couple of packages of granola bars. Here, I don't know if you like granola bars, and it's okay if you don't. Dawn opened a package before whispering in her daughter's ear. The little girl nodded and looked over at me with a smile. Thank you for the cookies, she said. My pleasure, I replied, returning the smile. And I still say you're a pretty little girl. The little girl giggled and buried her head in her mother's leg again. Before we start, I'd like to introduce myself, I said with a smile. I'm Robbie Wilder. Dawn blushed slightly. Yeah, I guess we didn't introduce ourselves yesterday. I'm Don Samuels, and this is my daughter Allison. Now that we have the introductions out of the way, let's sing, I said, beginning to strum my guitar. We started off again with Amazing Grace, which quickly drew a small crowd. As we continued to sing, the crowd grew larger and donations dropped steadily into Dawn's open guitar case. By 11:30, I could see that Dawn was getting tired and Allison was starting to get restless. We're going to take a half-hour to 45-minute break, I told the crowd, which had grown to about 50 or 60 people. We're just going to get a bite to eat, so come back and tell your friends. The crowd groaned a little but began to disperse. As I put my guitar away, I looked down at Allison. Hey, little one, would you like something to eat? Allison's head popped up, and she began nodding. Do you like hot dogs? Again, she nodded. There's a vendor just over there, I said, motioning with my chin. I'll get us something to eat and drink. How many would you like? Allison held up 2 fingers and said quietly, 2. How many do you think your mommy would like? I asked, smiling. Allison held up 2 fingers again and smiled shyly. I laughed. I can pay, Dawn said, fishing around in her guitar case. Save your money, I replied, waving her away. This is my treat. I suspect you need the money a whole lot more than I do. Thank you, Dawn said, nodding. I made $44.752 yesterday. I was able to pay some bills and give some money to my aunt. If I can make that amount today, it will really help Allison and me. Don't worry, you're going to make more than that today, I said confidently, heading over to the hot dog vendor. I brought back 6 hot dogs, 10 bottles of water, 2 apples, and a dozen cookies. Both Allison and Dawn ate hungrily. I suspected they hadn't had breakfast. As I ate, I realized I hadn't thought about Tanya or the mess I was facing while we played. Now, as I thought about it, my heart ached and I felt completely alone. The thought that I might never find anyone to love me again was overwhelming. However, playing my music lifted my spirits a bit, and I started mentally planning my strategy to strike back at Tanya, which also helped soothe my pain. After we finished eating, we moved to a different location with a wider open space and benches all around. We found a shady spot where Dawn could put her coat on the ground, and Allison curled up on it and soon fell asleep. We started the afternoon once more with Amazing Grace. A crowd began to gather quickly, and as people stood 10 and 20 deep, I told Dawn we needed to sing a little louder. I was impressed with the power and purity of her voice, and as we sang, people continued to drop money into the case. After about an hour, I noticed a television reporter standing on the edge of the crowd with her cameraman. After finishing a song, I announced a 5-minute break and walked over to the reporter. What's up, guys? I asked. The reporter, who had that polished look typical of news reporters, smiled at me. You're Robbie Wilder, aren't you? I smiled and nodded. Guilty as charged. "Is it true that you and Tanya are getting a divorce?" she asked. I remembered my instructions to manage the narrative Tanya was likely to push. I shrugged sadly. "True, but not my choice. According to the reports, she says that you subjected her to physical and mental abuse during your marriage." "If you're interested in the truth," I said, working hard to control my anger, "you should talk to the people who have worked with us all these years. They'll tell you I'm not abusive in any way. The last time I hit someone was in 5th grade when I punched Jimmy Fuller for pushing me down. So what are you doing singing here in Central Park?" The reporter turned the interview in a different direction. I wasn't sure if she believed me or not, but I had spoken the truth. I didn't know if the television station would broadcast my denial or spin it in Tanya's favor. The media often decided what they believed was true, whether it was or not, but there was nothing I could do about that. I had to play nice with the reporter and hope they would report what I said honestly. "It's a beautiful day," I finally responded with a smile. "Who wouldn't want to be out in Central Park today? But why are you singing with that girl?" "Oh, Dawn," I continued to smile, "I'm trying to help her earn some money so she can take care of her little girl." I pointed to where Allison was sleeping. I talked to the reporter for about 5 more minutes, making sure she understood that it wasn't just a divorce going on between Tanya and me. I touched on how I had been frozen out of the company and mentioned that Tanya had canceled my plane ticket to fly home on the same flight, replacing it with one 3 days later. After the interview, I went back to playing and singing with Dawn. Around 2:30, Allison woke up and was hungry, which was why I had bought the cookies. She was delighted, eating her chocolate chip cookies, drinking her water, and listening to us sing. By 3 o'clock, the crowd had grown to over 100 people, and then the police showed up. They told us we had to call it quits. Everyone dumps on the police, especially the New York City police, and some of it is justified. But the 2 policemen who told us to stop were really nice. They kept apologizing and told us it would be all right for us to come back tomorrow. However, if the crowd got too big, they'd have to shut us down again. I gave each of them a bottle of water and a cookie, assuring them it wasn't a bribe. They laughed and wished us well. I was glad the officers didn't know who I was and just treated me like anyone else. I took Allison to an early dinner. When they put our placemats down and gave Allison some crayons, she melted our waitress's heart. Allison asked in a tiny voice if it would be okay to color one of the pictures on the placemat, promising to leave the rest for others. The waitress brought 3 more placemats with more crayons and told Allison to color whatever she wanted. She even brought Allison a special dessert that she didn't charge us for. During dinner, I briefly explained to Dawn the idea rolling around in my brain all day. What I hoped to do was set up a new act with the 2 of us. Dawn was very hesitant at first, but I kept pressing that it would be a way to make some money to take care of her daughter. Finally, Dawn relented, saying she'd have to talk to her Aunt Claire. I didn't know if Dawn was just trying to blow me off, but I understood this was a huge decision for her. I was asking her to change her life and that of her daughter to follow me to Atlanta. I told her I would be fine with whatever decision she made. Besides, I said I still had a lot of pieces to pull together, and if I couldn't get everything worked out, I'd leave my new guitar for her and $500. But if I could pull it all together, then she and her aunt would have to decide if they wanted to come back to Atlanta with me and take a chance on my plan. I told her I'd call in the morning. If they weren't interested, the guitar and the $500 would still be Dawn's, and I'd fly back to Atlanta by myself. After 3 hours on the phone that night, all the pieces fell into place. Even Alex was on board. He wanted back into the music game, and his doctor had cleared him to work. Alex also told me that Todd had announced Tanya would be releasing 2 new songs the following week. I was sure they would be the 2 stolen songs, but there was nothing I could do about it because the songs weren't copyrighted. The thought that Tanya was going to profit from her betrayal just fueled my anger. I wanted to destroy her, which would become my driving force for years to come. Now I was chasing stardom with every ounce of my being. If my grandfather was trying to reach me from the great beyond, I certainly wasn't listening. I watched the newscast that night and was pleasantly surprised. Apparently, they had done some real investigation. They had contacted some of the people who had worked with me, and those people confirmed that they had seen no abuse. In fact, all of them stated that, as far as they had seen, I was a loving husband who would do just about anything to make his wife happy. Some even said I was too nice. When a sister station's reporter caught up with Todd, he seemed a little flustered. The reporter told Todd that the people working around Tanya and me didn't confirm the abuse, but Todd quickly said that all of the abuse had happened behind closed doors. He also informed the reporter that Tanya had never reported it for fear it would damage their act. Todd continued with his deceit, claiming that Tanya was finally fed up and couldn't take it anymore, which led her to file for divorce. When asked about freezing my assets and changing the airline ticket, Todd was smooth as silk. He explained that the courts would decide the asset distribution and that the ticket issue had been a simple mistake by the travel agent. I'll give him credit, he was a consummate liar. One part of the news story I liked was the segment about Dawn and Allison. They looked so vulnerable and scared as the cameraman photographed them. I was especially pleased with the final line of the report. The reporter said, even as Robbie Wilder's career appears to be in a tailspin, he seems more interested in making a mother and her daughter's lives a little better. I had recorded the interview and sent a copy off to Alex. My phone rang a few minutes later. Robbie, that interview was pure gold, Alex said brightly. It's not going to erase what Tanya and Todd have done already, but it will give us a leg up that they never thought we'd have. We talked for another half hour, going over what I needed to accomplish before Alex could start working his contacts to launch my new career. There were hundreds of decisions to be made and things to do. In the meantime, to exact my revenge, there was still a big piece that needed to be put into place. I had to convince Dawn and her aunt that my plan was genuine and not just a scheme. So the following morning, I called Dawn, and she invited me over to New Jersey to meet her aunt. The cab driver on the ride over to New Jersey was unexpectedly nice. I tipped him well. After a bit of searching, I found their apartment. It was a little old but well maintained, despite the neighborhood being somewhat seedy. The apartment itself was a simple 2-bedroom with 1 bathroom, sparsely furnished with a couch and a few pieces of furniture. One bedroom was larger with a bed and a dresser. The second bedroom had only a queen-sized mattress and some boxes holding Dawn and Allison's clothes. Robbie, this is my Aunt Claire Samuels. Dawn introduced me to her aunt, who was her mother's sister. Claire was a beautiful woman in her early 50s. Her brown hair had streaks of gray, and her face had a few wrinkles, but her eyes were bright, and she had a lovely smile. I learned more about Dawn and her life. Her parents had both passed away, her father in a car accident when Dawn was 15, and her mother 2 years later from cancer. Dawn had been married briefly but didn't want to discuss her ex-husband, other than to say he was possessive and mean. It was clear that Dawn's last several years had been exceedingly hard. It took about an hour of explaining, but eventually, both women understood everything and agreed. It was Claire who convinced Dawn that there was nothing for her in Allison in New Jersey or New York. In fact, Claire said there was nothing for her either and wondered if she could come with us. I was delighted with the idea, and having her aunt coming seemed to ease some of Dawn's fears. It took 2 more days for Claire and Dawn to wrap up their affairs in New Jersey. By 3:40 that afternoon, all 4 of us were on a plane to Atlanta. Even though the flight was a little less than 2 hours, I was eager to get started. I had ideas flooding my brain, with hundreds of details to manage, from getting Dawn, Allison, and Claire settled to booking studio time. I also needed to get Dawn a new guitar, decide on a new name, and begin Dawn's training as a professional singer. Fortunately, Alex would be there to help with much of what needed to be done. My plan was simple. Since Tanya had frozen me out of our singing act, I would create a completely new act with Dawn as my new partner. I planned to start slowly and then build up our act, hopefully reaching the very top of the entertainment world. I wanted Dawn and me to be bigger names than Tanya, which alone would frost my former wife's life. At the same time, Alex and I would look for ways to hurt Tanya's career. In my mind, this would go a long way toward paying Tanya back. Although I didn't believe we could achieve superstardom, I was convinced we would be bigger and better than Tanya because I knew her limitations. I was disregarding my grandfather's advice without a second thought and intended to work everyone to the bone to get us where I wanted to be. I didn't care who I had to step on to accomplish my goal, but I had no idea what the cost would be and who would ultimately have to pay. Throughout most of my career, I had never wanted to be a celebrity. That's why I always let my wife Tanya be the face of our group. I never considered myself an entertainer. To me, I was just a guitar player who also liked to sing. If people wanted to listen, that was great, but I was just as happy playing and singing by myself. But then my wife tried to destroy me personally, professionally, and financially. Now I was engaged in an all-out struggle to seek revenge. Tanya had betrayed me, humiliated me, and attempted to ruin my career. If that wasn't enough, she had also tried to damage me financially and stolen all the original copies of songs I had written. Okay, many of the songs weren't all that great, but they were mine, and some held great sentimental value. I was especially certain that the 2 newest songs I had written were very good. I had learned over the years that if you work at something long enough, you usually get better, and that was true for my songwriting. Even though I didn't realize it at the time, the songs I was writing now were some of the best of my career and would only get better. The flight from New York to Atlanta was just under 2 hours, but I was going crazy, sitting there with my mind racing over the hundreds of things I had to get done to begin my quest for revenge. To calm my anxiety, I started writing a new song. By the time we reached Atlanta, I had rough drafts for 2 new songs, Cheating Was Always in Your Heart and Desperate Nights But Bright Tomorrows. Back in Atlanta, I decided it would be best to work away from the city. I arranged for Dawn, Allison, and Claire to stay with my parents in Tifton. Initially, I considered renting a larger apartment for all of us, but I thought that might seem too overwhelming, so I rented a small apartment for myself not too far from my parents' house. My mom was thrilled with the idea, my dad, not so much, but he didn't fuss much. My mom and Claire became instant friends and both enjoyed taking care of Allison. Despite the attention the 2 older women showered on Allison, she took a real shine to my dad. Although he wouldn't admit it, they bonded. Often, when I visited, Dad would be playing games with Allison or reading her a book, or she would be sitting in his lap while he told her stories. 2 days after I got Dawn and her family settled, I brought her to a makeshift studio I had set up in a rented office. I hired an instrument teacher to help Dawn improve her guitar skills and a voice coach to develop her singing style. There were lawyers to meet with, costumes to decide on, and even a dramatic coach to help Dawn with her stage presence. I was draining my savings but didn't care. I drove everyone hard, including myself, but no one worked harder than Dawn. She practiced her guitar until her fingers bled, then applied band-aids and kept going. After a couple of months, she became a fairly good player. Dawn would never be a great guitarist, but she was still pretty good. When I felt we had made significant progress, I booked studio time in Atlanta. I specifically avoided the studio that Tanya and I had used. I could have gone back there, as the restraining order had been lifted, but the people at that studio had known about Tanya's infidelity and said nothing. To me, they were dead to me. I wanted Tanya to know how much I knew about her betrayal and that there would be consequences. When we arrived for our first recording session at the new studio, I feared all my plans might end before they even began. Dawn was absolutely terrified when I put her in front of a microphone for the first time. She would freeze up every time we tried to record something. Fortunately, my mom, Claire, and Allison had come with us. After 2 hours of making no progress, I was becoming completely frustrated. I called a halt and told everyone to take an early lunch. I was desperate to get something recorded because the studio and backup musicians were costing a lot. While the musicians were putting away their instruments, Allison wandered in. She leaned her head against her mother's shoulder and asked, "Aren't you going to sing, Mommy?" with worried eyes. Dawn looked down at her daughter, smiled, and nodded, "I'm going to sing right now, baby." With that, Dawn stood up and walked to the microphone. I signaled to the musicians to pick up their instruments and motioned to the control personnel to get ready. Dawn looked over at me, smiled, and nodded. The recording session then began in earnest. It took several hours, but we managed to record the 2 songs I had written on the flight. Alex released the new songs immediately with as much fanfare as he could muster. The songs did reasonably well, with Desperate Nights But Bright Tomorrows reaching number 12, while Cheating Was Always in Your Heart made it to number 19. These 2 new songs were meant to show the public that my new act was for real. Alex was exceedingly pleased because the songs accomplished that and more. Tanya, on the other hand, had launched her solo career with a great flourish. There were stories all over the entertainment media, and Tanya made several television appearances. She was careful not to push the abuse accusations, saying only that people had different opinions about what constituted abuse. However, what still burned at my soul was that Tanya had taken a song that was rightfully mine, and there was nothing I could do about it. The thought that she had probably destroyed my original copies made me even angrier. I had written one of those songs for my grandfather. It wasn't very good, but my granddaddy had tears in his eyes the first time I played it for him. Most people who knew Tanya well understood that her one consuming goal in life was to become a superstar, and I will give her credit, she was working tirelessly to accomplish her dream. What Tanya and Todd didn't realize was that while I was building up my new career, I was doing everything I could to undermine hers. I had people spreading both true and false rumors about Tanya, anything to tarnish her image. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that my plans might fail, so I drove everyone, including myself, even harder. Dawn was just raw talent, but I saw great potential in her. Alex had agreed wholeheartedly after viewing the news report of us in Central Park on YouTube. I felt fortunate that he had decided to come out of retirement to manage Dawn and me. The legal battles had turned into a mess. I only paid attention when the lawyers insisted. Aside from the restraining order being lifted and the court granting me limited access to the revenues from Tanya and my old company, I stopped caring. I knew that eventually, the divorce would be granted and the business problems sorted out, but right then, all I was focused on was revenge. The rumors I had spread were having a minor impact on Tanya's career, but in truth, her limitations were what really held her back. For me, I had to be a much bigger success than her because only then would I feel like I had truly gotten my revenge. Only then would Tanya realize that I hadn't been holding her back, she had been holding me back. I had never considered myself a celebrity. At our best, Tanya and I were middle-tier singers. We opened for superstars, played in medium venues with other groups, and headlined in smaller places. Throughout our career, Tanya was the one our fans wanted to see, not me. Even so, Dawn appeared to be totally intimidated by me, which made it hard to offer any corrections to her performance. One morning in the studio, after telling Dawn that she was too stiff and needed to let her body sway with the music, tears began to flow down her cheeks. "I'm sorry, Mr. Wilder," she said with trembling lips, "I'll do better." I replied through gritted teeth, "Dawn, please don't call me Mr. Wilder." This made matters worse as Dawn's whole body seemed to tremble with more tears flowing. "What should I call you?" she asked through her sobs. "Call me Robbie, or Hey You," I answered. I answered all those names. "Just don't call me Mr. Wilder." "That's my dad's name." "What's an ITAD?" Allison asked from the corner of the studio where she had been coloring. I groaned, realizing I had really stuck my foot in my mouth. "It's something I shouldn't have said," I explained to Allison. "It's something people call me when they don't like me." Allison got up, ran to me, and hugged my leg tightly. She looked up at me with a sad expression. "No one should call you that. You're a nice man." I gave Allison a kiss on the top of her head, and she walked back to her corner to continue coloring. I looked over at Dawn, who nodded at me. "My daughter is right. No one should call you that." I laughed. "I still answer to it, though." Dawn laughed, and we went back to work. After that, she started calling me Robbie. Still, progress was slow as Dawn remained intimidated by nearly everything. She could sing, but her stage presence was very stiff and awkward. At the end of 2 months, I had smoothed out most of the rough edges. The rest would have to come with time and experience. I gave Dawn a list of lines she could use during the show, and I would play off those and try to make her look witty and warm. Finally, I decided that we needed to perform in front of a live audience if Dawn was going to get better. After discussing it with Alex, we decided the best place to launch our act was where Tanya and I had begun, Big Carl. Alex made the arrangements, and Carl was thrilled. To my surprise, the bar was packed that first night. I was hoping for a half-full bar like it had been when I started with Tanya. Dawn was terrified and threw up shortly before we went on. I wish I could say that once Dawn was on stage she relaxed, but that wasn't the case. She looked like a deer ready to bolt at any second, so I took over and left her in the background as I talked to the crowd. I lightly touched on Tanya's and my issues, making a few harmless jokes at Tanya's expense before explaining how Dawn and I met. I painted a picture of finding this beautiful talent in the bustling city of New York. I told them that while New Yorkers could be the coldest people, when Dawn began singing, they stopped and actually smiled. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my great pleasure to introduce the songbird of Central Park, Dawn Samuels. There was a polite amount of applause. Just like we did in Central Park, I said softly to Dawn as I brought her forward. Then I started playing Amazing Grace. When we finished, the room exploded in cheers. Dawn just smiled shyly and nodded her head. About a third of the way through our performance, Tanya and Todd suddenly appeared. We were in the middle of a song when people began murmuring and standing up to look. Finally, Tanya strutted over to a table that had been reserved for her. That prick Carl never said a word to me, but when I looked over at the bar, he was standing there smirking. I smiled back at him. I couldn't be mad because he had warned me that I couldn't trust him. Rather than finish the song, I motioned for Dawn to stop and slide back a little as Tanya moved forward. I realized I could use this appearance to our advantage. I was sure Tanya and Todd thought they would upstage us and maybe unnerve Dawn. Well, folks, we are honored tonight that Tanya has decided to join us, I announced. The audience cheered. Damn, Tanya, you certainly can suck all the air out of a room, I added. Tanya smiled broadly as the room cheered. When the cheering began to die down, I pointed at a table of men in the far corner of the room. Tanya, don't you think that dress is a little conservative? I'm not sure if those guys over there can quite see your belly button. The crowd roared with laughter. Tanya's smile didn't leave her face, nor did she back down. Is that part of your charm that I read about? I asked with a big grin. You and I had quite a bit of that, didn't we? Only in your mind, Tanya said with a chuckle, which brought a laugh from the crowd. Ouch, I responded with my grin even larger. Some might say that's mental abuse, but as I look back, maybe you're right. Maybe it was all just in my mind. So you can see my confusion as to why you're here tonight. Tanya turned to the audience. I just wanted to show that there are no hard feelings. Our differences will be worked out in a court of law, and regardless of anything, I wanted to wish you well on your new venture. And as long as we're talking about performances, I'd like to let your wonderful audience know that I'm kicking off my latest tour right here in Atlanta at the Cobb Energy Performing Arts Center in 2 weeks. Knowing what she was doing, I pounced on this era of good feelings. Why don't you come up here and give these people a preview of your concert? Why don't you sing one of your old songs? Folks, would you like to hear Tanya sing? This was an unexpected treat for the crowd, and they responded positively. I was sure these patrons came to see me as a curiosity, wondering what I would do now that Tanya and I were no longer together. Plus, they didn't have to pay to get in, but now they were going to get a semi-reunion of Tanya and me. Of course, I had more than that planned. I whispered to Dawn that no matter what happened between Tanya and me, she should ignore it all. I also told Dawn I wanted her to join in for the second song. Knowing Tanya as I did, I was pretty sure she wouldn't pass up the opportunity. I didn't know which song she would want to sing, but the one I wanted her to sing with me was Patsy Cline's True Love. I was also pretty sure she wouldn't want to sing that particular song because it had been ours as a couple. But even if Tanya refused, Dawn and I would sing it, and it would have the same effect. After a moment's hesitation, Tanya nodded and made her way to the stage. Once there with a microphone in hand, I began playing Pretty Little Girl. It wasn't one of our hits, but it was a song that Tanya loved. Tanya even smiled at me before she began to sing. When she finished, the crowd responded warmly. Before Tanya could do anything else, I said, "Let's do one more." I immediately began playing True Love. Tanya looked uncertain at first but then shrugged and got ready to sing. However, when she and I began, Dawn joined in as well, which brought a roar from the crowd and a look of confusion from Tanya. As we continued to sing, I alternated my gaze between Tanya and Dawn. Finally, at one point in the song when it reached the line "For You and I Have a Guardian Angel," I turned away from Tanya and smiled warmly at Dawn. The symbolism was clear to everyone in the room, including Tanya and Dawn. I had moved on from Tanya, and Dawn was now my musical partner. When we finished, the room erupted with cheers. Tanya quickly thanked everyone and slipped away. The rest of the concert went very well, though Dawn never fully relaxed or felt at ease on stage. The next day's reviews were very positive, particularly praising our performance. They spoke especially of the wonderful partnership Tanya and I once had, lamenting our split, but they also wrote glowingly about Dawn and how she was a worthy replacement. I found this amusing because the media had never paid much attention to Tanya and me until we split up. Still, I was extremely pleased with the publicity we received. I think Tanya intended to embarrass Dawn and me, disrupt our show, and hype her new tour. She only succeeded in one of those goals, but even that limited success was short-lived. The following day, Alex announced that we would be starting a tour of our own, beginning at the Roxy in downtown Atlanta on the same day as Tanya's tour would begin. Alex told me that Tanya called him as soon as she learned of our tour and complained. He just laughed. Alex didn't tell Tanya that he had booked our tour so that about 80% of our concerts were on the same day and in the same city as Tanya's. I kept tabs on the reviews of each of our concerts. I especially remembered the review of Tanya's Atlanta concert. It was very favorable but mentioned how sad they were that Tanya and I were no longer together. However, when I read the review of Dawn's and my concert, it was also very favorable but did not mention Tanya. That had to really frost her. During that first tour, Alex had to book us into smaller venues because he didn't think we could fill a larger auditorium, and he wanted our tour to be financially successful. Some of the places we played barely held 300 people. We also opened for some of the bigger names in the industry. The tour lasted 14 weeks and was exhausting. Meanwhile, Todd had booked Tanya into larger venues, and they had great success initially, but by the end of their tour, they weren't selling out. Todd also turned down all offers to open for any big-name stars. Even though we were hustling from city to city on our tour, I stayed busy writing new material while on the road. I finished 5 songs, all but one of which were duets. My Woman and My Lover I sang as a solo. We started incorporating the new songs into our concerts one at a time, and when we returned to Atlanta, we hit the studios and recorded a new album with all 5 included. My Woman and My Lover began a steady climb up the country charts, hitting number 2 and staying in the top 10 for 6 weeks. A week after it hit number 2 on the country charts, it crossed over and made it to number 9 on the Billboard Pop chart. It had taken almost 8 months, but I would now say that Dawn and I were definitely at the top of the B-list, even though we weren't superstars. I was pleased with our rise in the music world. During the same time, Tanya's star hadn't brightened much, if at all. Still, she was doing very well, but Todd had failed to bring her to the top of the mountain or anywhere close. After one show, a reporter interviewed me and asked how I was doing since the split with Tanya. I told him I was doing great. Then the reporter asked what I thought about Tanya's new career. I knew he was fishing for a controversial moment, so I gave it to him. I have no idea about anything Tanya is doing, I said innocently. Is she still performing? Apparently, Tanya saw my comment and had some negative things to say about me during her next concert. Now there was an ongoing back and forth between Tanya and me. I always kept my comments lighthearted, while Tanya could get nasty at times. That didn't help her at all. The lawyers were pushing to finalize the accounting on our old partnership to close it down and distribute the assets. But when Todd took over the books, he changed the accounting system, making it hard to determine anything. It was a mess. By now, I knew there was nothing to be done about the songs Tanya had stolen. I had finally made peace with that, though I was still sad that the song I wrote for my granddaddy was gone. Meanwhile, the divorce had slowed to a snail's pace, mainly due to the problem with Todd's accounting system. I was entitled to half of what we had accumulated during our marriage, but Todd's convoluted accounting system made it extremely difficult to determine the assets and their physical locations. Todd had created dozens of corporations, and money flowed back and forth between them. My attorney had a CPA firm combing through the records to create an accurate list of everything, and from what the accountants were telling me, Todd wasn't being helpful at all. Much of the information they uncovered was extremely painful. When the CPAs went through the company's travel expenses, I learned that all of those public relations trips that Tanya and I were sent on separately were a smokescreen. I had been led to believe that Tanya went on her trips by herself while I was elsewhere in the country on mine. Todd was supposedly in Atlanta taking care of business, but he went on every trip with Tanya. Not only that, but they shared a room each time. They must have had a great time laughing at my naivety. Despite my legal troubles dragging on, my professional career had never been brighter. Our latest album was doing very well, and our concert schedule was full until the end of the fiscal year. Granted, most of the dates were openings for other stars, but they paid well. On top of everything, I had been nominated for a Grammy Award for Best Country Song for My Woman and My Lover. I continued to push Dawn and myself to be better, but I was becoming concerned about Dawn. She still struggled before every performance and took a good day or two to calm down afterward. I knew she was taking prescription sedatives, but I had no idea how much of a toll these performances were taking on her. One day, my mom brought Alice into the studio and pulled me aside with a stern look on her face. "Don't you dare hurt those girls," my mother warned me, gesturing to Dawn and Allison in the studio. "Mom, why would you say something like that?" I was truly shocked by her comment. I would never hurt Dawn or Allison. "Dawn is head over heels in love with you." My mother's eyes were intense, pinning me in place. "She's a nervous wreck because she's terrified that she'll let you down." If I had been surprised by her warning about hurting Dawn and Allison, I was absolutely stunned by her statement that Dawn loved me. I cared deeply for both of them, but I was almost 10 years older than Dawn. It never crossed my mind that she would ever be romantically interested in me. Besides, I wasn't sure that I could ever trust another woman again. "Mom, come on. I'm 10 years older than she is," I protested. "Dawn wouldn't be interested in me. She should find someone her own age." My mother shook her head with a tiny smile on her face. "Robbie, sometimes you can be so dense. That girl is hopelessly in love with you. If you would get your head out of your butt and stop trying to get back at Tanya for a second, you'd see it. Besides, her little girl considers you her father and loves you to pieces." I continued to protest my mother's assertion until she ended the discussion, warning me again not to hurt Dawn or Allison. After my mother left, I sat outside the studio watching Dawn and Allison playing with Allison's dolls. I always thought of Dawn as extremely pretty, but now I realized she was downright beautiful, and Allison was like a little angel. If I ever had a daughter, I'd want her to be exactly like Allison. I must have sat there for a good 10 minutes trying to sort out my feelings. One thing my mother had said was true: I did have my head up my butt concerning Tanya. Everything I was doing was to prove to my soon-to-be ex-wife that she had made a terrible mistake and to punish her for it. Suddenly, my granddaddy's advice came flooding back to me. He had warned me about chasing fame as a musician, but his advice was a warning about people missing out on life chasing a dream that might never happen. What I had done was much worse. I had chased a dream of getting revenge on Tanya, but I had made Dawn pay the price. The more I thought about Dawn and me together, the more I thought the idea was ludicrous. Why would a beautiful, talented woman like Dawn be interested in me? But then I began to examine our careers. We had been successful. No, we weren't superstars and not likely to reach that plateau yet, but I kept pushing for more. Even though Dawn never really warmed up to performing, she stuck with me. Maybe my mother was right. I went back and forth until I finally decided that we were changing everything today. When I walked into the studio, Allison squealed with delight and ran to me. I picked her up and twirled her around, then gave her a kiss on the forehead before putting her back down. I looked over at Dawn, and she was beaming at me. I decided to start by changing today's schedule. "I know I said that I wanted to record these 3 songs," I said with a grin, "but I've got a better idea. Why don't we just record 1 song today and then go do something fun? Would anyone like to come with me to Centennial Olympic Park and have a picnic?" "I would. I would. I would," Allison cried as she jumped up and down. I looked over at Dawn. "What about you? Would you like to get some hot dogs and go to the park?" The glow from her smiling face warmed me all over. Dawn nodded and said it would be like that day in Central Park. That's what I was thinking. We've been working too hard and we need to have some fun. I looked over at Allison and said, "Now, if a certain little girl wouldn't mind being very quiet, we can get done quickly." But the recording did not go well. First, the music track that had already been laid down was faulty. It took about 10 minutes to find the backup copy and get it ready. Then Dawn messed up on the first 2 takes, and I messed up the third. At that point, Dawn burst into tears. "You know what?" I said as I put my arm around her. "To hell with the song. Let's forget about recording it today and try again on Thursday. Let's not waste this beautiful day." Dawn sobbed on my shoulder for a few minutes and then lifted her head. "I'll be all right. We can get the song finished," she said. I could tell from her expression that she was afraid I would be disappointed with her. So, I did the first thing that came to mind. I gave her a warm hug and a kiss on the cheek. Then I turned to Allison. "Why don't we leave it up to Allison?" I said, still holding Dawn. "What do you think we should do? Should we stay here, even if it takes all day to record that song, or should we leave now and go to the park?" "Go to the park," Allison said so quickly that the words almost blended together. "Then it's to the park we shall go," I announced with finality. Before heading downtown to the park, we stopped by Dawn's condo where she lived with her aunt. There, she got Allison changed and grabbed some towels. I headed to the original hot dog factory and bought 6 hot dogs, a bunch of fries, cookies, and bottles of water. Our picnic began well after we found a nice shady area to spread a blanket. Once settled, I passed out the hot dogs and everything else. As Allison ate, her eyes never left the children racing around and through the water fountain. Unable to contain her excitement any longer, Dawn took off Allison's outer clothes to reveal her bathing suit. For the next hour, Dawn let Allison run through the fountains of water that shot up intermittently from a set of Olympic rings placed in the ground. Allison squealed with delight when a jet of water caught her as she ran back and forth across the area. When Dawn decided that Allison had had enough fun, she called her back to our shady area and gave her a cookie. I decided it was time to find out what Dawn wanted to do with her life. "You don't care much for performing, do you?" I asked matter-of-factly. Dawn looked at me nervously. "It's okay. I'm trying to figure out what we should do going forward," I explained. "So, tell me truthfully, do you like performing?" Dawn sat very still, looking at me as if trying to determine what answer I wanted. I also sat very still, trying hard to reveal nothing about my preference. After an awkward silence, Dawn shook her head but quickly added, "But I'll perform as long as you want me to." I had my answer and knew what I had to do. "Actually, I've been thinking about canceling our concerts for next year. We don't need the craziness of another tour. We both have enough money to keep us for quite some time, and we still have a fair amount of royalty money coming in." Tears suddenly flooded down Dawn's cheeks. "Are you firing me? Are you breaking up our act?" "No, not at all," I responded immediately, shocked by Dawn's reaction. The last thing I wanted was for her to think I wanted to be rid of her. For me, I just like making music. I'm just a simple guitar player who sings. I enjoy it almost as much when I play my guitar and sing by myself as I do when I perform before thousands of people. It's all about the music. It fills my soul and makes me happy. Dawn looked up at me, sighing. I love singing by myself or for people I love, but large crowds terrify me. Before I could say more, a disturbance in the park diverted our attention. When I looked over, I saw 3 black and 2 white teenagers harassing people, mostly targeting elderly individuals because they were the most vulnerable. I hate bullies, which caused me to get up immediately. They had settled on one particular older gentleman and had already pushed him to the ground. "Robbie, no!" I heard Dawn plead as I scrambled to my feet and headed over to help the man. "You'll get hurt." If I had thought about what I was doing, I probably wouldn't have done it. I'm not a fighter and know only a minimal amount about self-defense, but I hate bullies and knew that most were cowards. So, I confronted the largest of the teens, who seemed to be the leader. "Leave the gentleman alone," I said calmly but firmly. "And what are you going to do if I don't?" the large black teen said as he pulled a switchblade from his pocket. He didn't push the button to open it, but that might have been because I immediately kicked him as hard as I could in the groin. He instantly collapsed and rolled into a fetal position while I grabbed the knife and clicked it open. I hadn't intended to get into a physical altercation. My plan was to guide the elderly gentleman away from trouble, but now I was in it and expected the other 4 to jump me. However, other people had come running almost at the same time as me. When I looked for the other 4 teenagers, all I saw were their backs as they ran away from their friend and out of the park. In the short amount of time it took to help the elderly man up, I was shaking like a leaf. As I gathered my wits, a couple of ladies guided the man over to a bench. Moments later, Dawn was in my arms, sobbing into my shoulder, and Allison was clinging to her mother's leg, crying. "You could have been killed," she kept saying over and over again. I reached down, picked Allison up onto my hip, and held her head to my shoulder. "Hush, it's all right," I said as calmly as I could. "Nothing happened." "I don't know what I'd do without you," Dawn said, and kissed me gently on the lips. I kissed her back and hugged them both. As I looked around, a crowd was beginning to gather. I knew that the police would eventually show up, and I'd have to answer a bunch of questions. I was relieved that no one had recognized us yet. We had to get out of there, so I handed the knife to one of the men who had come to help and told him I was taking my family home. When I started to drive away from the park, I noticed that Dawn was still shaking from the confrontation. A glance in the rearview mirror showed me that Allison's eyes were glued onto me and her lips were trembling. "Dawn, are you and Allison going to be all right?" I asked, glancing in her direction. "Claire is taking that bus tour with my mom and dad, which means you'll be all alone tonight. You still seem very upset." Dawn shook her head. "I was just so scared that you could have been hurt or even killed. Look, why don't we extend the picnic at my house?" I offered with a smile. "We'll stop at your place so you can get some clothes, then we'll stop and get something for dinner. Perhaps it would be best if you guys spent the night with me. I can fix up the guest room for you and Allison. Would that be all right?" Dawn nodded with a growing smile on her face. Then she turned around to face Allison. "Ally, would you like to spend the night at Robbie's house with Mommy?" The squeal from the back of the car almost shattered my eardrums. "Yes, Mommy. It will be like having a sleepover." After getting to my condo, we watched a couple of Disney movies, ate takeout Chinese, and then I led them to my guest bedroom. That night, after Dawn and Allison had retired, I went to my room and climbed into bed. I guess my encounter in the park had taken more out of me than I thought. I was asleep in less than a minute. Sometime during the night, I was awakened by shifting on my bed. It took me a moment to realize that someone had slid under the covers with me. I felt Dawn's presence close to me. At first, I didn't know what to do, but after a few moments, it became clear that perhaps now was the time to explore if Dawn and I could be more than just musical partners. "You feel wonderful," I said as I turned to face Dawn. I kissed her gently, and she responded with a passionate kiss in return. "Are you sure you want to do this?" I asked cautiously. "Robbie," Dawn said, caressing my face, "I started to fall in love with you the second time we performed in Central Park. You were so kind to me the first time we played, despite me being so suspicious. I have to admit that it was mostly the money that brought me back the second day, but when I was late because I couldn't find anyone to watch Allison, I was in a panic that you wouldn't be there. When I saw you standing there with that warm smile on your face, it felt like my heart would burst with joy. You were so kind and patient with Allison. Until she met you, Allison had only known men who were mean to her. Her father screamed at her all the time." "I'm nothing special," I protested. "If your husband screamed at Allison, he must have been a real creep. Allison is as sweet a girl as you will ever find. How could anyone be anything but kind to her?" "He was worse than a creep," Dawn said with a catch in her voice. "I was afraid to leave him. I finally had enough when he took a belt to Allison. I was horrified." "Did you go to the police?" I asked. "Yes, and he was arrested, but he didn't stay in jail very long. During that time, I was referred to legal aid, and I got a divorce and a restraining order. Then I went to live with my aunt, but she was struggling to support herself, even with financial aid and food stamps. It cost so much to live in New Jersey. I was so scared and depressed until you sang with me that first day. When I got home and realized how much money you had helped me make, I was happy for the first time in months. I was finally able to pay some bills. You had promised to sing with me the next day, and that night was the first time I slept soundly in months. Ever since then, you've been there for Allison, me, and even my Aunt Claire. How could I not love you? Besides, when we were in the park today, you told everyone that we were your family." "Well, know this then," I said, stroking her hair. "I do love you and Allison very much, and I want to take care of you both for as long as you'll let me. That would be forever," Dawn said as she kissed me. We spent a wonderful night together, a deeply meaningful experience that I had never shared with anyone before. It was different from my previous relationships, where the connections felt less profound. Afterward, as I watched her lying next to me with eyes full of love, I realized how special it was to share such moments with someone who truly cares. I understood now that this feeling of true love was missing from my previous marriages. I believe my first 2 wives liked me, at least initially, but they never truly loved me. The next several months were hectic and stressful, but I was happier than I had ever been. I loved seeing Don's face light up when I walked into the room, and Allison became my special little buddy. If Don wasn't around, and sometimes even when she was, Allison would cling to me. The people in the studio began calling her my shadow. As the lawsuits dragged on, my relationship with Don grew stronger and more loving. I reduced our workload and told Alex to cancel all the concerts after the Grammys. He was slightly disappointed but understood. We agreed to continue doing a concert or 2 each year and possibly a television special if there was interest, while also recording new songs. With the Grammys approaching, Don was looking increasingly tired, but we were finally preparing for our last concert. Afterward, Don would have a week to rest before the awards ceremony, and then we would be done for the year. We usually ended each concert with the old Patsy Cline hit True Love. Before starting the song, I decided to do something I had been contemplating for weeks. Once the crowd quieted, I got down on one knee and pulled out a small box with a 2-carat diamond ring. I asked Dawn to be my wife. Her reaction was priceless, and she said yes with joy. We embraced, kissed gently, and the crowd went wild. We smiled and waved before starting our final song of the evening, True Love. The performance was very special, and months later, I watched the video, noting how many people in the audience had tears in their eyes. We planned to marry 2 months after the Grammys. However, we had decided to leave Atlanta behind, as neither of us enjoyed living in a big city. We considered moving back to Tifton, but since my parents had recently relocated to Florida, we chose to follow them and bought a house in the middle of the state, about half an hour from Orlando. About a week after settling into our new home, the lawsuits came to an end. As expected, everything was split 50-50, and only the accountant's final audit remained. My attorneys apologized for not securing more, but I was relieved that the fight was over and Tanya was out of my life. Then, a real shock hit. Todd had embezzled about $2 million. The accountants had thoroughly examined Todd's records and exposed the theft. Todd was arrested, and Tanya immediately began divorce proceedings. Although Tanya's career was still intact, her dream of reaching the top with Todd had been shattered. You might have thought I would be ecstatic about this turn of events, but I felt sad and tired. The scandal surrounding Todd's betrayal and the subsequent fallout with Tanya left me feeling more weary than victorious. News of Todd's theft and the song scandal added to Tanya's troubles. While I should have been thrilled, I found myself reflecting on the impact of these events, especially on Tanya. I no longer loved Tanya, and while I was sad for her, I wasn't going to lose any sleep now that Dawn and I were engaged. My main concerns were centered on my soon-to-be wife and my new daughter-to-be, Allison. I was a little sad to be dialing back our act, but I would gladly trade any musical career for the love of Dawn and Allison. Unfortunately, just as I found true happiness, disaster struck. After our last concert, it was clear that Dawn was completely worn out. I was also exhausted, so I suggested we skip the Grammys and just rest. To my surprise, Dawn really wanted to go. When I asked her why, she smiled and said she wanted to see all the famous people. I couldn't help but laugh. However, the Grammys turned out to be a nightmare. My whole life began to spiral out of control. I had planned to jump back into the studio as soon as we returned from our tour, but Dawn was so exhausted and suffering from some intestinal problems that I told her to rest and insisted she see a doctor. Our primary care physician diagnosed her with diverticulosis and prescribed antibiotics, bed rest, and a change of diet. Dawn followed the advice, and it seemed to help. While Dawn was recuperating, I recorded a song, Please Say You'll Love Me Forever. I had hoped to record it with Dawn, but due to her health issues, I did it as a single. I figured we could redo it as a duet once she was better. Alex released it as a single, and I hoped a Grammy win might give it a boost. On the day of the Grammys, Dawn complained of a stomach ache again. I suggested we skip the event, but Dawn insisted on going, saying she would take some antacid. I agreed as long as she rested the whole day before the ceremony. We were both dressed to the nines, me in a tuxedo and Dawn in a beautiful light blue gown. Before we left, I turned on the television to the station broadcasting the Grammy Awards, hoping Allison would see us on the red carpet. As we arrived at the theater, I noticed Dawn was pale, but she insisted we go in. I should have insisted on taking her to the hospital instead, but when I suggested it, she refused, agreeing only to go to an urgent care unit. Halfway down the red carpet, we were asked for a brief interview. Dawn eagerly agreed, knowing Allison would be watching at home. However, as the reporter started his questions, Dawn turned pale and began to cry. I quickly picked her up and rushed back to the street, hoping to find our limousine, but it was already gone. Fortunately, I found a policeman and begged him to call an ambulance. 5 minutes later, we were on our way to the nearest hospital. Dawn was taken away into a hospital corridor, and I was directed to a waiting room. I had never been so scared and distraught. All I could do was pray and cry. About 2 hours later, my parents and Claire arrived with Allison, who was bundled up and asleep. My mother hugged me tightly, and I cried on her shoulder for a long time. When I had no more tears, I held Allison in my lap. 3 hours later, a surgeon came out to speak with us. He explained that Dawn's intestines had ruptured, and they had to remove about 4 inches of her lower intestine. She would need to wear a colostomy bag for a few months. Their biggest concern was the infection that had already spread to her abdominal cavity. If they couldn't control it, Dawn could die. Around 6 o'clock in the morning, Allison woke up in my arms and asked where Mommy was. I tried to explain, my voice choked with emotion, that Mommy was very sick and the doctors were trying to make her better. Allison hugged me and said, "Mommy told me you would take care of us and keep us safe, so as long as you're here, I know Mommy is going to get better." I broke down again, and Allison began to cry as well. My mother took her from me, and I sat there, overwhelmed. Soon after, a nurse appeared and said we could see Dawn for a few minutes. I didn't correct her and tell her we weren't married yet. I was afraid they wouldn't let me see Dawn. She looked so small and frail in the hospital bed, surrounded by IVs. When I sat next to her and took her hand, she opened her eyes and smiled weakly. "How do you feel?" I asked. "I guess about as well as you look," she replied with a scratchy voice. "I love you," I told her, kissing her hand. "I love you too," Dawn said before drifting back to sleep. I was told I could come back that afternoon for another visit, so I gathered my parents, Claire and Allison, and we went home. My mother made us breakfast, but I wasn't very hungry. Allison insisted on eating her breakfast sitting on my lap. When she went down for a nap around 9:30, I crashed and slept for 7 hours. When I returned to the hospital by myself, Dawn was awake but looked very pale. For 3 days, Dawn ran a fever and slept most of the time. I was terrified she might not survive. Finally, on the 4th day, the fever broke and she started to get stronger each day. Eventually, we were able to take her home. Dawn needed a lot of help because even simple tasks, like getting in and out of bed, were a struggle due to the surgery. The next 4 weeks were very hard for her, and she experienced significant pain. I learned that healing from major surgery isn't a steady process. You can have a few good days followed by setbacks. There were days when Dawn felt very depressed and would break down in tears. About 7 weeks after the initial operation, Dawn had to undergo another surgery to reattach everything and remove the colostomy bag. Recovery from this second surgery was even more challenging than the first. At times, Dawn seemed so depressed that I wondered if she would ever fully recover. However, after about 3 months, she was strong enough to do something other than visit the doctor. I decided to have a picnic by the lake on our property. We had bought 50 acres of land and built our house there. The contractor had dug a lake to use the fill to elevate our house and surrounding area. I invited my parents and Claire to join us. It was the first time I saw Dawn truly relaxed and enjoying herself, even though she mostly sat and watched. She was happy. As we sat there watching Allison play with my dad, Dawn turned to me and asked about the Grammys. I smiled and shook my head. "Oh, I'm sorry," she said, looking at me to see if I was disappointed. "I'm not," I replied. "If we had won, there would have been a lot of pressure to start touring again, and I know you wouldn't be happy with that. Right now, I'm not interested in doing anything except staying close to you and Allison. Alex has scheduled a concert for us toward the end of the year, but I'm not sure I want to do even that. We've also been asked to be part of a Christmas special, which I think we should do, especially since they want Allison to be part of it." Dawn looked out over the lake, then turned to me with tears in her eyes. "Thank you for singing with me in Central Park." All I could think to say was, "Thank you for letting me sing with you." We were married for weeks after that picnic. It was a small ceremony on our patio with just immediate family and close friends in attendance. I can't explain it, but this wedding made me happier than I had ever been in my life. I was even happier than when I married Tanya. I guess I always felt that Tanya didn't feel the same way about me. Deep down, I was always afraid she would leave, and when that happened, it was one of the saddest days of my life. But as they say, when God closes a door, He opens another one. Tanya closed one door, and Dawn opened a new one for me. I had been so focused on Dawn and Allison that I hadn't paid attention to anything outside my family. At our reception, people were invited to share anything about our wedding day. Alex stood up and announced that my single, "Please Say You'll Love Me Forever," had shot to #1 on the country charts and had also crossed over to the pop charts, reaching #4. Our guests cheered, and Dawn gave me a long, passionate kiss. Alex wanted us to go back on the road, but I adamantly refused. It was Dawn who changed my mind. She didn't want a full tour, but she did want me to go back out, promising to come with me as long as Allison wasn't in school. Reluctantly, I agreed. As we traveled from one venue to another, I was glad Dawn had insisted. Whether it was a small nightclub or a large arena, we were met with enthusiastic sellout crowds. Occasionally, Dawn would join me on stage for a song or two, and the audience always responded with great enthusiasm, though these appearances were rare. Dawn joined me for the concert at the end of the year, which was sold out months in advance. I even heard that tickets were being scalped for $1,000 or more. The police arrested someone trying to sell 3 tickets for $4,000. The TV special, A Down Home Country Christmas, featured Dawn and me performing with several other country groups. Since we weren't performing in front of a live audience, Dawn really enjoyed the show. The program was a massive hit, and Allison stole the show with her charming performance and beautiful voice. It first aired in mid-December but was so popular that it was rebroadcast twice more before Christmas. Offers quickly started flowing in for Allison to perform, but Dawn and I were adamant about protecting our daughter's childhood from the pressures of show business. We refused all offers. When Allison turned 16, we allowed her to record her first single, which went platinum almost immediately. Despite this success, Dawn and I were united in not letting Allison tour until she was 18. We did, however, agree to one performance each year, the Country Christmas Show. Allison looked forward to this annual tradition, and it became a cherished part of our holiday celebrations. 11 months after Dawn and I married, we welcomed Trey Robert into the family. 15 months later, Cassandra joined us. Allison took on a nurturing role with both of them and would organize little shows featuring all 3 siblings. Dawn would often roll her eyes at Allison's announcements of new shows, but I loved the enthusiasm and creativity. I recorded 10 more songs over the years, some of which were very successful, while others were less so. After 12 more years of touring, I began to grow weary of the constant travel and time away from my family. Dawn had been incredibly supportive of my career, and whenever the kids weren't in school, they would join me on the road. Our 50-acre property had expanded to 75 acres, with the main compound now walled and gated, and we had 24/7 security to discourage overly enthusiastic fans. As I approached my 45th birthday, I reduced my concert schedule to only 7 or 8 performances a year. Dawn limited her performances to mainly the Christmas show but would occasionally join me on stage for a few songs. Whenever she did, the audience responded with great enthusiasm. As my touring schedule wound down, Allison's career was in full swing. She undertook 3 major tours a year and participated in charity concerts and television appearances. While I had written most of the successful songs she recorded, I was now recording very little. Alex remained my manager but was training his son, John, to eventually take over the role. Despite being 78, Alex had not yet decided on his retirement. My father passed away 3 years ago, and my mom and Claire now live together in a condo. They spend their days exploring thrift stores, a habit my father never complained about, though he was sometimes frustrated by how slowly they distributed their fines to charity. I want to share a funny anecdote about my first wife, Susie. When Tanya and I separated and it made the news, Susie sent me a postcard featuring her husband's latest dealership. It read, "I may have gained a few pounds, but you've lost about 120 pounds, your wife. You were such a loser." When I married Dawn, I sent Susie a postcard of my own. It was a picture of Dawn and me right after our wedding. The note read, "Susie, sorry it's taken me so long to respond. Thank you for your concern during my difficult times. I have to admit you were right, but about the wrong thing. I was a loser for marrying those 120 pounds, not for losing her. As you can see, I've replaced those 120 pounds with 110 pounds of pure love." And Susie, really, a few pounds? I think you need to buy a new scale. I truly regret the time I spent trying to damage Tanya's career. My obsession with revenge was misguided and, in the end, it was Dawn who suffered. I had driven everyone to chase a dream that wasn't even mine. My grandfather was right, it almost cost me the most important thing in my life, Dawn. In the end, Tanya's career didn't reach the heights I had hoped. She had some hits with my songs and others that were written or stolen for her, including one that reached number 7 on the country charts and 3 that cracked the top 20. Over the years, I ran into Tanya occasionally, and she was even an opening act for 2 of my shows. I was initially reluctant, but Dawn convinced me to allow Tanya to perform, suggesting it would provide closure. I did sing with Tanya during those shows, but I refused to perform True Love with her, a song I reserved exclusively for Dawn. After the second show, Tanya and I spoke briefly. She apologized, saying, "I know saying I'm sorry doesn't mean much now, but I am." I replied, "You're right, it doesn't mean much now. However, I've long since moved past what happened between us. When my first wife left, I thought my life was over, but then I met you, and we got married, and that wouldn't have happened if Susie hadn't divorced me. The same thing happened when you left me. If you hadn't, I never would have met Dawn or had the career I've had. So as far as I'm concerned, it's all good. However," I said with a sigh, "there's one thing I'm still a bit upset about. I assume that you destroyed the original copies of the songs you took." Tanya nodded. "I couldn't take the chance of them being found. I should have been angry with Tanya, but I just couldn't muster the energy. Tanya had spent much of her life feverishly pursuing fame, chasing a dream that was never really hers, and she let the rest of her life slip away. Sadly, she's still pursuing it today, and I have no doubt that if Tanya had the chance, she would still steal more songs in a heartbeat. But age is starting to catch up with her, as it does with all of us. I can't criticize her too harshly because I once chased that same dream for years, not for personal stardom, but to surpass Tanya. Now, I can't bring myself to boast about my success over her. The futility of my pursuit became clear when Dawn fell so ill. I had been so consumed by my quest for revenge that I lost sight of what was truly important. I eventually gave up on trying to outshine Tanya, and ironically, it was then that my career truly took off. I must admit, being a celebrity isn't all it's cracked up to be. It's challenging to go anywhere without being recognized. I've resorted to wearing disguises when I want to go out in public, especially with Dawn. She finds it amusing and enjoys each new disguise, though they only work so well. If I stay out too long, someone always seems to recognize me. I was looking forward to getting home after a grueling tour, but I had one last show to perform at the Stagecoach Festival in California. I was one of the headliners and thought it would be an easy gig, just 2 songs, and then I'd be on my way. Unfortunately, I had to wait as I was performing third from the last that night. When I finished my songs and started to leave the stage, the crowd began chanting for more. I quickly retreated, but the chanting continued, creating an awkward situation for Chris Collins, who was scheduled next. The crowd wouldn't quiet down, and Chris, who had 3 #1 hits in a row, was waiting off stage. He started laughing and eventually came over, grabbed my arm, and pulled me back on stage. The audience erupted with excitement when they saw us together. After a few minutes of chaos, things calmed down a bit. Chris suggested we sing together, which excited the crowd even more. We began performing, alternating between our own songs and singing together. Just as we tried to wrap up, Sandy Younger, known for her incredible voice and stunning presence, joined us on stage. She claimed we were having too much fun and insisted on participating. For the next hour and a half, the three of us entertained the crowd, switching between solo performances and group songs. I was exhausted and drenched in sweat by the end, while Chris was in better shape but still sweating heavily. Sandy, however, looked as fresh as ever. After the show, all the performers and support staff gathered at the hotel for drinks and conversation until after midnight. By the time I reached the jet I had hired, I was too keyed up to sleep. I arrived home around 7 a.m. the day before my 45th birthday, feeling drained. I spent the next 10 hours catching up on sleep. When I finally woke up and got dressed, everyone was on the back patio where Dawn had prepared a barbecue dinner. I arrived just in time. "Glad you could make it, sweetheart," she said, giving me a warm kiss. "Oh, gross, Dad," Trey said, sticking out his tongue. "Get a room," Dawn said with a smirk. "It's at the head of the stairs on the right. We'll be making good use of it tonight." "Oh God, Mom," Trey shouted. TMI, TMI, TMI. "What's too much information?" Cassandra asked, stepping up next to her brother. "Nothing for the baby of the family's ears," Trey smirked. "Stop calling me a baby," Cassandra said, punching her brother's arm. "You're only a year older than me," Cassandra said. 15 months, Trey corrected. "Okay, you two, just settle down," Dawn chided them. I laughed and grabbed a plate, filling it with my spare ribs, baked beans, and cornbread. I also grabbed a beer and found a seat on the far end of the patio. Our house was set up on a rise that overlooked our 75 acres. Since we first bought it, we had expanded the compound to include a swimming pool, tennis courts, and a basketball court. I had ATV trails added and a barn with 3 horses. We also expanded our man-made lake to accommodate a powerboat and a sailboat tied up at the dock. The only thing Dawn didn't put up a fuss about was the swimming pool. She had fought tooth and nail about the horses, but they were something Allison had wanted since she was a little girl. I finally convinced Dawn to let me get 1 horse and hire a riding instructor, promising that Allison would eventually get tired of taking care of it and we could get rid of it. Obviously, Allison never got tired of horses, which is why we now had 3. In fairness, Allison paid for the other 2 horses out of her royalties from her first hit song. Dawn admitted that she had been wrong about the basketball and tennis courts. Trey and I frequently went out to shoot hoops, and it wasn't unusual for me to come home and find a game of pickup basketball going on with Trey and his friends. Sometimes I'd join in if the sides were uneven. I didn't kid myself, I couldn't keep up with these kids, but I could set a mean pick. The tennis courts were another story. Cassandra took to the game and, after a year of lessons, was good enough to make the school team. The biggest user of the tennis courts was Dawn, who loved to play with Cassandra and her friends. She even got me out there, and twice a year, we hosted a charity fundraising tennis championship, raising $40,000 to $50,000 each time. Everyone seemed eager to participate, except me. Dawn made it clear that opting out was not an option, and I'm convinced I was included mainly for comic relief. All my kids learned to water ski on the lake, and Trey loved to sail. I can water ski decently but don't particularly enjoy it. I go along for the family's sake. I love the ATV trails we've created throughout our property and also have access to state park trails behind our property. Every 4th of July, I would fly my old singing partners George and Simon down with their families, along with George and Mabel and Tyron and his family. They would stay with us for a week, and we would end each night with a cookout and singing. It was wonderful to have such loving family and good friends. As the years rolled by, I felt my age more with each tour. Each one became harder and harder. On the night of my 45th birthday, Dawn had rented out my favorite restaurant in Orlando for a private party with about 150 friends and relatives. During the evening, Allison handed me my guitar and said it was time to sing for our supper. We sang for about 20 minutes, when I was surprised by what happened next. Trey and Cassandra had been taking music lessons for years, but I hadn't realized how far they had progressed. I had heard them sing when Allison would host music shows at home. They had sweet voices back then, but were shy and unsure. When Allison called for a break, she instructed me to sit next to my wife in the front. Dawn snuggled close to me, and I soon realized she knew what was coming. I didn't have to wait long. Trey and Cassandra joined Allison with their own guitars. I expected Allison to take charge, so I was completely surprised when Trey took the mic, told a few funny stories about his sisters, and then launched into a guitar solo. Stunned is the only word to describe my reaction, but I was even more blown away when Cassandra joined him and they took the room by storm. But that wasn't the biggest surprise. When the cheering died down, Allison took back the mic and announced that the three of them had written a special song for me. Cassandra started off, Trey soon joined her, and Allison blended her voice in. It was some of the sweetest music I had ever heard. As the words flowed, tears streamed down my face. Later, I learned the song was titled With the Love of My Father. My 3 children recorded that song, which made it to #1 on both the country and pop charts. That night, after the celebration, Dawn and I spent a quiet, intimate evening together. I told her how much I had enjoyed the birthday party and mentioned that I didn't think anything could top it. I was proven wrong when my 50th birthday rolled around. For weeks leading up to the big 5-0, I watched with great amusement as my kids and wife scurried around, working on their plans. They would often huddle together and giggle when I asked what they were up to. I probably would have paid more attention, but I had other things on my mind, things I didn't want my family to know about, as they would have been furious if they found out. On my 50th birthday, I discovered they had planned a surprise brunch with about 50 guests. Anyone who didn't know my family well would have assumed that was the big birthday surprise. However, after my afternoon nap, I was informed that I needed to be ready for dinner by 6 o'clock. My suspicions were piqued. I figured they were planning another amazing birthday dinner, but I was wrong. The limousine was a new touch, a stretch model that allowed the whole family to sit comfortably with space to spare. The tinted windows made it hard to see out and impossible to see in, which was smart considering Allison's celebrity status and my own. We had a great time as the limo navigated through side streets until we went through a gate to a small parking lot. I didn't think much of it until the car stopped. When I asked why we were stopping, Allison told me to follow her if I wanted my present. It was no surprise that my daughter had hidden my present somewhere I wouldn't find it, as I had a reputation for snooping around gifts, especially during Christmas. I followed Allison, who raced ahead, and the rest of us struggled to keep up. It wasn't until we reached the stage that I realized we had entered through the back entrance of the Mercury Center, the newest music venue in our area. I was impressed that Allison had chosen such a venue to hide my gift because it was an excellent place for me not to discover it. The rest of the family was laughing and joking as we tried to keep up with Allison. When I finally reached the stage, the lights in the auditorium flared on, and a roar erupted from the seats. Over 20,000 people were on their feet cheering. Allison's backup musicians scrambled onto the stage and began playing, and soon, the entire audience was singing happy birthday to me as a large cake with 50 candles was wheeled out. At the end of the song, Allison gave me a tight hug and a kiss on the cheek. Cassandra and Trey joined us with tight hugs. My parents and Aunt Cla also hugged me warmly. Then Dawn enveloped me in a heartfelt kiss, which drew even more cheers from the audience. As things began to settle down, servers brought in dozens of large, pre-sliced birthday cakes and started passing them out, eliciting even more cheers. Allison then shared a memory over the lively crowd, recounting how, when she was a little girl, I had sung with her mother in Central Park. This brought another round of cheers. Allison then said she wanted to start the evening with the very first song my wife and I had ever sung together. The night was filled with music. We bounced from one performance to another, sometimes Allison's hits, sometimes mine. Cassandra and Trey each had their moments with their own songs and covers of other artists' hits. Trey and I performed dueling banjos from the movie Deliverance, and even Dawn sang 3 songs on her own, showcasing her beautiful voice. The birthday concert went on for 3.5 hours, ending with a duet between Dawn and me. The crowd continued to cheer for more even as we exited the stage. As we made our way back to the limo, I felt a pang of guilt as I saw the joyful glow on Dawn's face. I prayed she would never find out about the secret life I had been leading, as it would crush her. A little over 3 months after the birthday concert, I was finally able to end the secret life I had been living. The relationship ended by mutual agreement. I then resolved to be the best and most attentive husband in the world, vowing never to have secrets between Dawn and me again. However, I struggled to keep that promise, even though I knew it would devastate her if she ever found out. For almost 4 years, I had managed to keep my personal life private, enjoying some wonderful experiences during those years. I had reduced my concert schedule, performing only once or twice a year, yet every time a new date was announced, tickets sold out in minutes. Despite the reduced number of performances, I continued to write and record songs. I had accumulated 28 platinum records, with 20 being huge crossover hits. I also wrote songs for my 3 children. Allison had 4 #1 hits, while Trey and Cassandra each had 2 top 5 hits from the songs I wrote. All 3 of my children had married, Allison to Alex's grandson, Daniel. Since Alex had been my manager for years, Allison and Danny had grown up together. Daniel, an excellent studio guitarist and a decent singer, was more interested in the business side of the industry, following in his grandfather's footsteps. Trey, despite his talent, didn't enjoy performing as much. His decision to stop performing was influenced by Jenny Tallow, the university professor who he met during a concert at the university. Jenny, the university's advisor to the Student Senate Entertainment Committee, faced numerous problems with the sound system that she was trying to fix. Trey, amused and sympathetic, took matters into his own hands, arranging for a portable sound system to be delivered and set up. His actions led to a confrontation with the union electricians, which Jenny handled assertively. Trey fell in love with Jenny that night and spent 2 months convincing her to go out with him. They married a year after their first date. Trey later chose to give up performing to avoid being away from home and instead took a job teaching entertainment business at the university where Jenny worked. His classes became very popular, leading him to teach additional courses. Cassandra, our youngest, was the most troubled. Unlike her older siblings, she thrived on performing and was building a notable career. Cassandra's career was taking off, but she started getting involved in the partying scene, which led to excessive drinking and experimenting with drugs. Thankfully, she avoided addiction, and after a heartfelt intervention with Dawn, she significantly reduced her drinking and stopped using drugs altogether. Things seemed to improve initially, but then Cassandra's situation worsened again. Her music career continued to rise as she went back on the road, but she met and hired Lance Talbot, someone I had strong reservations about. Lance, a charming lead guitarist with questionable morals, quickly became a significant part of Cassandra's life. Despite my initial attempts to support him with studio time, a vocal coach, and songs I wrote, Lance's lack of substance soon became apparent. He ultimately left Cassandra for another singer, leaving her devastated. However, Cassandra soon had something to hold on to. She was pregnant. In a short span, all of my children announced they were expecting. Cassandra gave birth to a daughter named Lacey. Jenny and Trey had a son named Jason 2 months later, and Allison and Danny welcomed another daughter, Angelina, a month after that. Despite my promises to leave my secret life behind, I found it challenging to fully let go. About 16 months after Cassandra had Lacey, I resumed my activities, knowing Dawn would eventually find out. I wanted to spend one last evening with my grandchildren before confessing everything, anticipating that my time with them might be restricted afterward, if not entirely cut off. On Memorial Day, the whole family gathered at our house. We set up cribs in a guest room so all 3 babies could sleep together. I took my guitar and a recorder up to their room, telling everyone I was going to sing them to sleep. My family smiled at me with affection as I went upstairs, though I couldn't help but worry about their reaction once they learned of my actions. For that night, my focus was on enjoying this precious time with my grandchildren. I started the recorder and sang nursery songs as the babies, Lacey, Jason, and Angelina, looked up at me from their cribs. They smiled and giggled as they listened. One by one, they drifted off to sleep. I sang songs their parents had made popular and shared funny stories about their parents, Dawn and me. Tears began to flow down my cheeks as I read the final entry in Robbie's journal. I recalled that morning when I awoke to find that Robbie hadn't come to bed. I discovered him still in the chair beside his grandchildren, but when I went to wake him, I found that Robbie had passed away. The coroner said he had suffered a massive heart attack during the night. Robbie had been partially right about our reaction to his secret. We were deeply saddened and disappointed to learn about what he had kept hidden, not because of the secret itself, but because he had chosen not to share it with us. What Robbie had been so afraid for me to find out was that he had cancer. He had successfully battled it when it was first discovered, but it returned. At the same time, doctors determined he needed open heart surgery. They planned to address his heart issues first and then begin cancer treatment, but his heart gave out before they could proceed. The tears continued to flow as I wished he had confided in me so I could have supported him through what must have been a frightening time. But that was Robbie, always trying to protect me, even from the first time we sang together in Central Park. The family was devastated, but we were overwhelmed by the outpouring of sorrow from Robbie's fans. Thousands of floral arrangements appeared around our front gate, and people came from all over to leave flowers or sing Robbie's songs. The outpouring wasn't as extensive as when Elvis Presley passed, but it was close. Many radio stations dedicated an entire day to playing our family's music. I didn't notice much of it because I was so grief-stricken. It took months before I could function again. Alex had Robbie's recording of him singing to his grandchildren released as an album, which quickly rose to #1 on both the country and pop charts. It stayed at the top for 6 weeks on the country charts and 8 weeks on the pop charts. I'm doing better now, but sometimes thinking about Robbie brings tears to my eyes again. It's less frequent now, though. Right now, I'm focusing on the exciting news that both Allison and Jenny are expecting again. I can't wait for the babies to arrive, though a part of me is saddened that Robbie will never get to meet them or that they will never know their grandfather. Just thinking about it makes me tear up again. Oh, Robbie, I miss you so much. With Thanksgiving and Christmas approaching, and the network preparing for our annual Christmas show, I'm both eager and apprehensive. The show is expected to draw one of our largest audiences ever. Despite my reluctance to perform, I look forward to it, though it will feel so strange without Robbie. I know he'll be watching and smiling down on us. Robbie often said he was just a guitar player who liked to sing, but he was so much more. I love him dearly and will miss him profoundly. Dear listeners, please share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.